Well, my guest had to leave. Thank you so very much for inviting me, and good evening. I want to say thank you to Dr. Ken Ford again for inviting me to join you tonight. And this is my second visit, not here in Ocala, but in Pensacola, where I first was invited to join and be a lecturer. And when I got that invitation, I wondered, Dr. Ford said, go on the website and find out who we were, or who we are. And when I checked out the website, I said, why me? I have no technical skills. I'm not a scientist, so what value would I add? But I was impressed with all that IHMC does. And as scientists and researchers, I wanted to know why they were inviting a community activist. And so I was enthralled with the concern that was expressed about the Pensacola community at that time and its surrounding environments. And now he has an office here in Ocala, and how, in fact, they are becoming a part of this fabric. So I look at your new surroundings, and I say, what an opportunity you have to make a very real impact on your community. So thank you, Dr. Ford, for your hospitality. Thank you, Ann, for squiring me around and making certain that I showed up on time and in the right place. And she left me to find my way back across the back door, back to the office today from City Hall, but I went out the wrong door. And she didn't tell me there was a back door. So I looked around and I said, this doesn't look familiar. So I looked behind me and there was another door, and so I made my way back across the street. So as we depart tomorrow, my daughter and I and my grandchild that you heard, that we're going to take advantage of your Florida weather. We're going to go to the beach in Clearwater. Haven't been there before, but I understand how beautiful it is. And so she's going to play in the sand with my daughter, and I'm going to lay in the bed and watch television. So today is an opportunity that I did look forward to. And so I want to talk about what I did, what I feel is going on in our nation today, and tied in a little bit with what I've learned in Atlanta. I met and conversed with your mayor and city manager, and I think that you have an opportunity by those conversations that I held with them about the will of an individual to make change happen. I don't want to talk too very long because I want to go back and watch television like the rest of you when President Obama gives his speech tonight. Because I want to hear what he has to say about solving some of our problems. But I do want to articulate some of the concerns all of us share as we look forward to the future of our country and our communities, and what we wonder about that future of our communities and our country. In 2007, when I met with you before, I had just recently retired from an organization called the Atlanta Neighborhood Development Partnership, an organization that I founded in 1991. And it is all about my profession, which is community economic development. And much of my talk tonight will revolve around the lessons I learned as the founding president of that organization, and what brought together what I call a partnership in Atlanta, Georgia. And I will also share with you the lessons that I learned along the way from others throughout the United States, because I was the one in my family that had the itch to go someplace else. So I've lived in Washington, D.C., I've lived in New York, look, not in New York, but in New York environment, and worked there. I lived in California. And so I came back to Atlanta with what I call a combinations of lessons learned. Throughout the United States, we have some of these issues in each and every city and each and every community that I'm going to talk to you about. But some of my lessons came as growing up in a segregated South as a preacher's kid. So that's why I like to talk, for one, because I'm a preacher's daughter. And I was raised in a segregated South, needless to say, Atlanta, Georgia. But it was a place where I witnessed the civil rights movement, where I lived through those days. I grew up as a daughter of a Baptist preacher, so a lot of my leadership skills was honed in the Baptist church. I have some funny stories on the sideline that, you know, when my father, on Easter Sunday, you know how we like to wear our beautiful hats, and we show up looking gorgeous on Sunday, and the church is full to capacity with children and people trying to keep, like my granddaughter, quiet. And I said to my father, I said, Daddy, let us put on a pageant this Sunday. And so he said, a pageant? And I said, yeah, because nobody's going to pay any attention to you. They're there looking pretty. So let's talk about a pageant. And so the youth department put on a pageant. And so that gave me some of the foundation, my father allowing me to do things like that, to organize and to try it out and to make it happen. And so that was one of the bases by which I formed the rest of my life. So those lessons I've applied to almost everything I've done since then. I happened to grow up in a community and in an environment where my father said it was no option. Go to school, get a good education, get a job when you finish, or get married. And being that I didn't get married as fast as he wanted me to, and he was beginning to bestow on me the category of being an old maid, I decided that I would get a good enough job that would allow me to live the way I wanted to. So I had very few career choices. And as Dr. Ford showed me some of the things that they're doing, the robotics and all, that was not even a notion. It wasn't on the drawing board. And many of you sitting in this room can relate. But our children today, my granddaughter uses the iPad now. And she can play those games. And she's going on 3. She hasn't reached 3 yet. But just think about the mind of these young people. And just think about if we had those in my day, what was be going on. So getting a job, getting an education was not optional. So I grew up understanding what was expected of me, and that I had the right of any child to do what I wanted to do. My father used to say, do not allow anyone to define who you are. You define who you are. And so that gave me the sense of purpose, the sense of being. And so I'm saying all of this to sort of give you an idea of what sometimes it takes for us to instill in our people what it will take to lead. And so it was the basis of what was my life calling. Because when I went to school because, as I said, I had no option. I had no idea what I wanted to be. And I knew I didn't want to be a teacher, I didn't want to be a social worker, I didn't want to be those things. But I had to take the basic courses to get out of school to satisfy what my father demanded of me. So I lived in other places. But when I returned to Atlanta in 1985, I turned to Atlanta that was not the city I left. I had been in a city that cared about your neighbor, that knew who you were when you were living next door to them. I came back to a city that was not the city I left. And so I began to ask the simple questions. Why? What happened along the way? And I'm going to pull out my glasses so I can read my notes a little better. But as I came back to Atlanta, I asked these questions, and I wondered what had happened. And I said that something had to be done, because the neighborhoods that I grew up in had deteriorated to a point that I did not recognize. And I decided that based on the lessons I had learned along the way, that the private sector was virtually untapped. And the private sector had to be one of the mechanisms by which we had to work. My father was a very engaged person during the civil rights movement. And one of the lessons I learned was that when he took the case for employment opportunities for a segment of the population that did not have jobs, they listened and they responded. So I said the private sector was a vehicle by which we can do some of the things I wanted to do. But I had also learned that when I was in California. When I was in California, it was the private sector that formed an organization that I worked for. It was the corporations in Silicon Valley that formed an agency called the Urban Coalition. And they formed it because they said they had some of the same ills that existed in other parts of the world, other parts of our country, rather, and that we had to do something about it. And so they developed housing for the working poor and for people to live closer to their jobs. They developed the first community investment corporation for minorities out of this coalition. They developed fair housing programs. And so you would look at these and call them social programs, but they were developed by the private sector membership. And why? It was in their best interest that they would have somebody and people close to where they work. And so the access to getting to the jobs and housing and transportation became the bedrock by which we began to build communities. And so I learned the very simple lesson that if, in fact, you take the problem to them and you say, this is how we want to do something about it, they will listen. And so this was what I carried back to Atlanta, Georgia. And so in starting up and beginning the startup of ADNP, it was not easy. I talked and I showed up at places. I used to say, and I'm going to write a book, that my title is going to be Elbowing My Way to the Table, because I wasn't invited. I just showed up. And Andy Young one time told me when I was elected to be first vice chair of the Democratic Party, I said, how do I crack this old boys network? And he said, show up. And I said, okay, I know how to do that. He said, and then they'll believe that you were supposed to be there. It works. It works. But luckily for me, the stars were aligned in what I was trying to do, and that the vision of Atlanta was to capture the 1996 Olympics. And so I was talking about improving our neighborhoods, and people were like, you know, there she goes again. I wanted to do something about housing. I wanted to do something about this. And why was this in existence? And they would go, ha ha, okay, it sounds good. But the Olympics was announced. They had sold to the world that we had wonderful racial harmony. Okay? Blacks and whites got along together. And then all of a sudden, we invited the world to come see. And what were they going to see? All the stadiums were positioned in neighborhoods that were the most blighted. Why? Because 9 times out of 10, those neighborhoods don't use their voices strong enough to prevent something as massive as a stadium coming into it. And so in order to get to these massive stadiums, they had to go through very neglected neighborhoods. And that was my opening. And then there are also some folks that had seen me show up at these meetings. And they said, there's this lady that's been talking about revitalizing neighborhoods. And when they asked the question, well, who is she? Well, you know, she's got kind of a loud mouth. And she will tell you like it is. And then there was the other question as well, can we get along with her? And I said, what would that take? Because my concern should be your concern about how, in fact, do we strengthen and rebuild neighborhoods. And I say this for a reason, to show you that, or to tell you that, it's the will of a person or a group of persons that can make the difference. And I won't shut up until the job gets done. And so that was the spirit by which I believe all of us that we won't give up until the job gets done. And so every city throughout the United States can have that someone who wants to rebuild community and to also use whatever resource that avails itself at that given time, and to know when an opportunity presents itself to use it. So I lead off with this, and I say again, going back to what Dr. Ford said to me when I asked him, why were you inviting me? And he said that cities are systems too. And the people who participate in and are interested in those systems that impact their overall quality of life. And I said, I can relate to that. And so I admit that my technical knowledge is minimal, because when everybody's wanting a smartphone, I want a dumb one. I want one that is very simple to operate. But I have a deep respect for research and for technology, because I always will need to utilize it in some aspect. And research in particular is important because it can guide what I say when I can back it up with facts and figures and research information. And so I have found that living examples exist. And although I like to be thought of as being very smart, I have to admit that I have borrowed lessons from someplace else and put them in a little sack to be used at some given point in time when it's necessary. I have learned how to utilize, because of my experience in working for a national foundation, what philanthropic agencies look for. I have utilized the experience of working in California with the private sector to understand that the private sector too wants to have an environment where they can have a workforce close by where they live. And so all of these were lessons that I have learned along the way that came in handy when I moved back to Atlanta, Georgia. And I looked at the places that I grew up in and did not recognize any longer. So I said to myself that this is something that may be bigger than me, but why not try? I want to see people who can live in neighborhoods that are safe, secure, and sound. I want to look at people who can go to school and have places where their children learn, and they can prosper and become a part of our society. So therefore, I want to build my conversation with you tonight, keeping some of Dr. Ford's statement in mind, but talk about equity. And I will discuss those issues of economic disparities that we are confronted with within today's environment, and point to what I believe are the equity issues we must address as a country and as a city and as a community. And a lot has happened since I was here in Florida in 2007. And our nation seems to have taken some giant steps backwards, brought on by the deepest economic recession since the Great Depression. And I remember one time my father saying to me that when economic insecurity exists, the worst of us comes out. And today, I think we're seeing some of the worst of us. And those insecurities are there as we believe that nothing can be done, and that somebody else is the cause for our problem and our despair, and that our recessionary problems are somebody else's fault, not mine. If we didn't have to do for them, we wouldn't have this problem. And so we are going through all of those recriminations, and you witness it with both conventions taking place. So when I last spoke to you, I was a little bit more optimistic about what our future was, because I was still in the afterglow in my retirement, and that I was feeling good, and I could look around. And I had said to my daughter, you know, I hope that at some point in time in your life, you can look back on what you contributed and even touch it and know that you made a contribution to society. And so now I'm seeing those contributions begin to have some fraying edges. And I'm saying to myself, what can I do now to continue to fix it? and work on organizations to move individuals and families successfully through the economic mainstream. And so I talk to myself a lot, and I say, you know, okay, you're tired, and you're aging, and yes, I'm a bona fide member of the senior society, and what can you do? Well, there's a little bit left, and I'm going to try and continue to be a voice as I begin to raise the alarm signals that are affecting us. I raised those signals when I was serving on the Federal Reserve's Consumer Advisory Board. And several of us community activists said around 2006, said to the Board of Governors that if our economy continued to pin its future on the strong housing market and the financing strategies that banks employ, then this country is in trouble. And so I'm not an economist, and we are community advisors. And so they said, brush it aside. And we had voiced our concerns based on the fact of what we saw happening in the very neighborhoods we worked in, that people who did not read the fine print began to face foreclosures. They did not know that this fixed loan was only for 3 years, and then it was going to escalate past what they could afford. They did not read that there was a balloon payment in 5 years that they had to meet. So they didn't read the fine print. And so what happened was that they lost their home, and they had to move because they couldn't afford to refinance. Their income did not match the need. But guess what? These products didn't stay confined to a certain target population. They added some more bells and whistles, and it went nationwide. Who didn't want to pay a 20% down payment? Most of us. We were out for 5% or 10%, and we gave down payment assistance, and we provided a way for people of lower economic means to own their first home. But when it was that bust, people began to move away from the homes that they had invested in. The neighborhoods that we had worked so hard to rebuild began to show those early signs of fraying. And this was what we were trying to convey to the Federal Reserve back in those times. So what we witnessed was that boom. That boom was over. And we had worked so hard to rebuild these neighborhoods, and the boom was taken away, that hard work. So housing units were left vacant. Many blocks began to witness the deterioration. Subdivisions were not finished. It went on. And the banking requirements that were there began to disappear as well. So what we found was that the banks had an overwhelming portfolio of empty houses. What we found was that condos and apartments and houses, as well as office buildings, were left uncompleted. And so we then began to see empty communities. We began to see the problems that I mentioned earlier, where we began to blame somebody else for our problems. But then the jobs began to disappear too, because especially the state jobs and the teachers' jobs began to lose, because guess what? A lot of it is built on tax revenues and tax collections. And when the tax collections begin to go down, the jobs disappear, and the teachers' jobs disappear, and they begin to cut what? Education. That is one of the things on the chopping block. And so we begin to see those services that we were used to begin to disappear. And so we ask ourselves the question, how deep can the cuts go? But look at what we have to tackle in the months ahead. We have to tackle this thing in a very positive way, but in an equity way, a way that makes certain that all of us put something back into the pot and all of us benefits. Angela Blackwell Glover is the founder of Policy Link, and they operate out of California, and if you don't know them, they do some wonderful research. And she defines equity as a way of a just and fair inclusion. An equitable society is one in which all of us can participate and prosper. It is full communities of opportunity, places that provide everything people need to thrive, including high-quality employment, good schools, safe streets, community services, and education. So I submit to you tonight that equity is more than just a notion. It is our only hope in a changing environment and a changing economy. Because what we have to plan for as a nation has to be inclusive. It has to be involving all of us. And we are a society now that is all of us. We are not black or white. We are black, white, Hispanic, and Asian, and others. And this is the nation that we are today. And we have got to accept that and become inclusive in our policies. So I want to say to you that equity is more than just a notion. It is our hope in this changing economy. So as we reposition housing and think about housing, we must think about it in a way that is inclusive. It's promoting mixed income housing, a song that I sang for so very long. Mixed income housing is a place that we can go to from rocking chair from cradle to the rocking chair, rather, not from rocking chair. The other place is a grave, and I don't want to go there yet. But from cradle to rocking chair, that we want to be able to have a place that I, as a senior citizen, can live next door to some young people, in which I do. My community is one that ADNP developed, and I'm the senior citizen in the complex, because all the young people around me make me feel a little bit more vibrant, because they have babies. So I bring my grandchild around to play with the babies in the neighborhood. And so that I see a change of dynamic in the community that was once depressed. People are moving back into the city, and they want to raise their children there. And they're changing the school systems, and they're making certain that businesses come. So I can eat close by, I can walk to a place to eat, I can walk to a park, I could walk to other goods and services in my neighborhood. And so that's what I call an inclusive environment, a place where you can live and thrive. You can work and play and live in an environment like that is more than what most of us enjoy every day. I, too, lived in an outer suburb area, you know, the fringe of Atlanta, and I drove into my driveway every day. I didn't know my neighbor because I didn't have to interact with them. I just drove in. My playground was my deck. You know, we barbecued on the back deck. But it wasn't a neighborhood like I grew up in. I grew up in a neighborhood, if I walked out of the house, my neighbor had their eye on me and told on me if I misbehaved along the way. We don't have those neighborhoods anyway, because we don't want to speak and chastise somebody else's children. But that was not the neighborhood of yesterday. It's not the neighborhood that I grew up in. So mixed income housing became an important philosophy. And so you know of probably some Hope 6 housing projects. That was based on the notion promoted in Atlanta about mixed income housing. And so the housing authorities throughout this country began to adopt that philosophy. Why can't we adopt it for our communities? Why can't we say that we want to have a mix of people at all economic incomes living in our community? What is wrong with that? What is wrong with individuals who want the same quality of life you want? I say nothing, because I don't care how poor I am. When I have a child, I want that child to have all the advantages that society has to offer. And today they're known as sustainable communities. Sustainable communities that allow people to go from cradle to rocking chair. Sustainable communities that offer all the amenities that a community ought to offer. And so now we have a program offered by the federal government, and it's called Sustainable Communities Initiative. And it involves 3 legs of government, which is federal. The federal government has transportation, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and HUD, all coming together for the very first time to make certain that grants are made available to provide the sustainability that any community needs. And so if you haven't looked into it, that is one of the programs to look into. So it is the first time, as I said, my knowledge, that they have done anything like that. Jobs and the middle class and the poor are at risk today. That's the other subject area. Today we live in a nation where unemployment is 14.3% in some cities, but the average is around 9.3%. And that's in cities by cities. You're lucky if you can get it down to close to 8%. But we have somewhat gotten comfortable with that high level of unemployment. So we've got to do something about it because the middle class, as we know it, is disappearing. We all know that. You hear it every day about what are we going to do about the middle class. The middle class is in fear because they were able to afford a home. They were able to send their kids to school. They were able to do some things that they could participate in today's environment, you know, to have a quality of life. But now too many of them have become a part of the new poor. So what do we do about making certain that we can lift those people back up and today that they can participate and grow and prosper in our environment? And so what has emerged over the years because of this crisis has been unprecedented. But what are we going to do in order to reverse it? If inequality was one of the factors that got us into this this problem and this crisis, dealing with inequality has to be the mechanism to get us out of it. And we have, what I say by that is that we have to accept it, and we have to do something about it, and we have to be willful in our way of doing it. And it's not just about simple legislating policy, it's about implementing it. And it's not just about the taxes and everything else we're afraid of. It's about the ability to understand how we as a people want to make something happen. And the effort to promote growth and equity does not need to start from scratch. It has to be the will of the private sector, which I call our corporate community, to reinvest back in this country. And they have to be supported by local, state, and federal government. We have to also bring the jobs back from overseas. We have to bring manufacturing back to the townships. And we have to bring and make certain that our schools are functioning. We have to make and bring back what has made our country great. And we have to make, I call this, Made in America, a source of civic pride. Again, you know, that we were the manufacturing domineering entity for cars once upon a time. And so now we got so many foreign cars, we don't have the other cars that we made here in America. But we've got to reverse that pattern, and it has to become a source of civic pride. My city, Atlanta, has been noted in the Business Chronicle that I read just last week, that is saying that we have the greatest inequality between the rich and the poor than any city, and maybe Miami came in third. Now, I mean, that is not something that makes your heart beat, you know, and that you feel proud about. And so I asked this question about the inequality question again. How do we get past that? Because if we can make certain that all of us participate, we won't have that gap. We won't have this fight that's going on between the Republicans and the Democrats. We won't have this argument that we are hearing that destroys our civic pride. So these are things that really cause us to be has a problem, because there's a gentleman that spoke to the Blank Foundation a couple of years ago, and I never will forget his comments. And I called him up the other day and I said, remind me what his name was. His name was Joel Kotkin, and he's a recognized futurist. And he was speaking, and he said that a city that fails to bring its low-income population into the middle class will not prosper. A city must embrace the fundamental principle that one of the primary historic roles of a city is to nurture and grow its middle class. So I said, let me take that a little bit further. If we fail to strengthen the middle class as a nation, we will slip further behind the developed nations globally by our failure to build that middle class. The workforce of our future and our past has been the middle class. So then I think about education. It's one of a necessary steps. In 1970, as I read, the United States had the world's highest rate of high school and college graduates. Today, according to an Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, we slipped to number 21 in high school graduates and number 15 in college graduates. What does that say? What does that say about our need and our dependence on education? How do we become competitive in a global economy if we don't educate our young? So we have a real problem in our education, and I get sick when I hear that education is on the chopping block and that we're not taking care of our systems that make certain that we will prosper and we will grow as a nation. So we have to not only have education for our young, but if we're going to be technologically smart, we're going to have to retraining for us old folks. And if we don't have it, we are going to be like me asking for the dumb phone. Okay? Because my granddaughter knows how to use the iPhone, and I don't even want to tackle it. Let's talk a little bit about race. I have to bring that up because I'm African American. But today, 40% of children and youth in America are people of color. And by 2025, they will represent the majority of youth. We know what happens to people who do not graduate, but 72% of black young males drop out every year, and they are jobless. Jobless. People of color, however, will determine the nature's future. Guess what I said earlier? That we have no more just black and white. We have black, white, Hispanic, Asians, and others. So we are that melting pot. And we have got to understand it, embrace it. Because if they're going to be our future, do they understand what they're inheriting? Are they prepared to lead us? Are we going to be globally competitive in 2025? And if we go on the path that we've been going, I would dare say that we're not going to be. Poverty is a part of our fiber. We don't need it to be a part of an accepted part of our fiber. We've got to do something that makes certain that all of us can find a job and do well. Condoleezza Rice at the Republican convention was the only speaker that addressed education. And she said that we need our schools to produce the people for our future. I'm not saying, quoting her exactly, but if we're going to stay competitive, we need to have that. So I'm not going to take too much longer because I haven't gotten a hand back there yet. But do I have some more? 5 more minutes? Okay. Time for questions. Okay, see, I told you she keeps me on target. But I will take this liberty. As I said, I'm a senior citizen. I can go on these tirades, and I can tell people what I've learned along the way. And I want to just say to you that we can. Does that sound familiar? Yes, we can, and we must. And with that, I will step back and allow the questions that Ann is looking at me on the sidelines to be quiet for a minute. And maybe I can address some more of what I wanted to say when we wrap up.
Anybody in the audience has left a question? I have a question.
Yes.
I worked for 10 years in revitalizing an urban neighborhood. Thank you. I worked for 10 years in an urban environment in Jacksonville and Springfield, and we had 2 groups. We had the gentrifiers that worked in our neighborhood to revitalize the historic homes, and we had the people who were interested in economic and cultural diversity. And my question to you is, it was a long struggle and a difficult struggle because the gentrifiers had the money, but what are your ideas for bringing those groups together so you can succeed in making a successful urban revitalization in our neighborhoods?
Policy. It's the problem. I always said that young people don't want to live in the suburbs and cut grass, that the cities are a place for them. And however, the lessons of the past did show that when neighborhoods began to change, displacement took place. What a city has to do is to set in place a policy that allows for affordability in that community. When I say in that community, it must be a part of it. So if a developer comes in and wants to add infill housing and all, they got to make a commitment to set aside units for affordability, for people who are making less than 50%. And that sometimes are your seniors, less than 50% of the median environment, income environment. Policy is the only way that I see it takes place. And people like yourself who works in a neighborhood has to be vigilant and not cave in to the fact that all of a sudden my next door neighbor does not want someone of lesser income living next door to them. I always ask the question, why does it matter? If I have the same aspirations you have, that I want something great for my child. So that's the way I would respond to that. I saw another hand. Yes, sir.
What's puzzled me is with...
Wait for the microphone.
What's puzzled me is with all the money spent and with all the bailouts, why wasn't the homeowner bailed out?
Well, that's a continuing question because I think there's movement now to try and force some of the banks to do something about foreclosure rates and to restore the loans and to make certain that there's modifications taking place to enable the family to stay there, to work with them to stay there. So why it wasn't a part and pushed in the beginning to get something back for everything we were giving, you know, it was a trade-off.
You know, in Austria, the average mortgage is 40 years at 1%. Nobody loses a house with a 1% interest.
Yes. Well, you know, we're now at close to it, 2.5% in some instances. But we're not getting loans. The banks have tightened up. That was a part of what I was going to say. The banks are not lending. I was talking to the mayor over lunch, and it's what we want to accomplish, he says, in downtown Ocala is, you know, housing, mixed income housing in our downtown area. But the banks are not stepping to the plate. How do you convince them to do that? I say there's an instrument that people know of called Community Reinvestment Act. Anytime a bank does business in your community, they must do something for that community. And, you know, oftentimes we don't know about some of these laws that's on the book. We got to learn how to use them to our advantage. So, can I go to someone over here and then I come back to you? Okay. Yes.
The grants that you spoke of from the 3 departments in the federal government, who applies for those grants?
Who applies for them?
Yes.
Nonprofits, some educational facilities, city governments that string together a group of people or a group of organizations. It's meant to be inclusive. And so you have to have buy-in. It's just not one organization stepping to the plate. You've got to have buy-in from a group of people, a group of organizations.
And it's not just government then? It's not just your local government or your county government?
No, it's not. You are a nonprofit applying to the government. Okay, it should be right back down with you. Yes.
I want to just ask a question about education, and there's an expectation, especially as I've learned within the state of Florida, that if you don't get a college degree, that there's, you know, that you have somehow failed. But there are a tremendous number of jobs, especially in the manufacturing area that you talked about, that don't require college degrees, but require people with great skill and who can produce nice products, who have tremendous creativity, but don't need a college degree. So in my particular case, I was able to earn a PhD, but my older brother went to a VOTEC high school and learned how to be a tool and die maker. And so he participated in that way and was very successful. So is there a need for us to refocus our expectations in order to better support our manufacturing community?
Yes. The answer is yes. When I lived in California, again, as I always said, that's where I grew up, you know, as a young lady. I had to survive on my own, for one. But we formed a relationship, the high schools there and with the private sector, which was in Silicon Valley. The simple question was asked by me, do they really need to go to a junior college to be able to gain an entry-level job in your company? And this was to the president of Hewlett-Packard, and he said, no, but none of the high schools have vocational education anymore. And so I said, there's this program in Philadelphia that has, a school within a school. And it was a dropout prevention program. And in that program, there was, you know, a lot of kids in Philadelphia that was in the construction trade. Silicon Valley was electronics and computers and all of that. Brought that notion back. Again, you know, saying I was very smart, I wouldn't borrow somebody else's idea, and formed a relationship between the school system in San Mateo County and the private sector. The private sector went into the classroom and taught. They reshaped the curriculum for young people who didn't understand why they were in school in the first place. Reading, writing, arithmetic, where is it going to lead me? And out of that program, they had an option. I wanted to make certain that they could pass the SAT, if that be their desire. But they also, if their family circumstances said so, they could go straight to work. So he gave them an option. And in that sense, they were entry-level employees to Silicon Valley employers that needed people to come in to work, that were putting together those widgets, those things that, you know, make something run. And so there was entry-level positions that was available. And so I say, no, we don't always need. In fact, my brother is in heating and air. He makes more money if he wants to, based on his desire to get up and go to work now he's in the scene, than I can make. Because what is a service call cost? Just to come out and find out what's wrong with your air conditioner. And so they can make a decent salary. The auto mechanic that you take people to, some of those skills are not even taught. They just learn them, and they're able to fix your car. And so we have to get past this notion that everybody has to have a college degree in order to survive in our country. You have to have the technical skills, and our schools can provide that. But vocational education became a dirty word because it was seen as pushing somebody into a course or into a curriculum because they were dumb, and the only things they could do was work with their hands. But, you know, today's world requires all of that. So I would say, yes, we should have technical education in our high schools as well.
This is the last question.
Okay, please do. And this, can we get one more last question in? Because I promised this gentleman down here. So after you.
All right, one more last question.
Okay.
You mentioned the income and wealth inequality, which has been growing in the United States since the early to mid-1980s. What specific policies or practices would you recommend to strengthen the middle class and reverse that trend?
Well, again, I say bring back the jobs to our shores. You know, bring back the jobs that we worked for and that we had in our townships. The call centers, I mean, you know, if you call to get something fixed today, you got to listen real hard at the other person on the other end of the phone because they have this dialect we just can't catch. And so, I mean, so our call centers, just something as simple as that, bring them back, you know, to the United States. And the fact that we grew up expecting to have a livable wage, there's nothing wrong with it because we built this great society that said that we all wanted to live in decent places. There's nothing wrong with bringing those jobs back, and that's one of the major things that I support 100%, is bring our jobs back home.
Last question, quickly.
This gentleman right here.
Thank you. I've worked in a variety of things in my lifetime as a salesman and as an engineer. But I managed a small chain of 4 stores for a while. And I will tell you the most astonishing thing that ever happened to me was when somebody came in and wanted to work. There was a lot of people that wanted salary. There's a lot of people that wanted to work in a suit. There were a lot of people that were interested in a 1-hour lunch period and in getting home exactly when the clock said 5 o'clock. But none of them didn't want to work. When somebody came in that really wanted to work, they moved up so rapidly. They were a store manager in a matter of months, not years. They went back to school, many of them, and did very, very well. And I think the secret answer of all of it is a real desire to work. We're coming to a situation in this country where enough work will be done by machines so that work for the rest of us will be a privilege.
Right.
And I think that's what needs to be taught and emphasized.
I used to have in my staff, I used to say that if you work for me, I'm going to drive you crazy because working for me, you have to give up eating, sleeping, and sex. That's my answer. It's leadership. It's leadership. That's actually close.
On that happy note, let's thank our speaker.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.